This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Breathe deep. Imagine your legs more limber in Duluth Trading Double Flex Denim. Envision euphorically squatting for that can of suds, bending for your toolbox in a state of bliss, lunging for your laser level on a whole new level. Relax and allow the flex to fill you with ability. Find your inner flex in Double Flex Denim only at Duluth Trading.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Evio. The bond between Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and President Abraham Lincoln was crafted from necessity, a shared sense of patriotism and the weight of deep personal loss. It was a bond forged in the crucible of a young nation at war with itself. Once a fierce critic of Lincoln and his administration, Stanton would surrender to an abiding respect for the man and develop a strong working relationship and personal friendship with the president. Lincoln thrived on voices of opposition. He appointed Stanton as Secretary of War in 1862, 1 year after the Civil War began. That same year, amidst the raging battles and skyrocketing casualties, the president and his god of war would endure their own family tragedies. The Lincolns lost their 11-year-old son William to typhoid fever in February of 1862. 5 months later, in July, Stanton and his wife would lose their infant child to an unknown illness. By 1865, Lincoln would come to think of Stanton as a trusted advisor, confidant, and one of his closest friends. His voice was among the few Lincoln called upon when he felt things were at their worst. Stanton was the one to offer Lincoln his most honest feedback when mistakes were made. Not to admonish, not even to make Lincoln a better leader, but because it's what was best for the country. Lincoln knew Stanton's first loyalty was to the Union, and he could rely on that loyalty like the North Star. When faced with the reality that Lincoln wouldn't survive the attack at Ford's Theater, Stanton wept. With one shot, John Wilkes Booth had begun the unraveling of a nation. Booth had silenced the steady voice of leadership. He had murdered Edwin Stanton's closest friend. As a result, Stanton didn't seek permission to assume responsibility. He knew that in times of chaos, calm and decisive action was necessary. Someone needed to take charge. At some point, in his grief, on those gray early morning hours of April 15th, Edwin Stanton's fierce loyalty to his country would be eclipsed only by his love for his fallen friend. Stanton chose vengeance, and there was perhaps no man in history better equipped to realize that mission. As Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton had the entire Union Army at his disposal. Someone needed to take charge, and take charge he did. Welcome back to the Ides of April. I'm Alec Baldwin. Episode 5, Ghosts of the Potomac. Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as the 17th President of the United States from his room at the Kirkwood House on the morning of April 15th. Though purely coincidental, it's hard not to imagine another vice president named Johnson taking the oath of office in a hastily arranged private ceremony. Nearly a century after Andrew Johnson's swearing in, Vice President Lyndon Johnson would be sworn in aboard Air Force One in November 1963, following the Kennedy assassination. Following his swift ascension to the presidency, Andrew Johnson experienced a crisis of confidence. To his credit, Johnson was aware of his shortcomings and allowed Stanton to assume full responsibility, effectively running the country during a time of crisis. Among Stanton's first moves in those early hours of April 15th was to immediately recall General Grant, who was visiting his children in New Jersey. In pursuit of Booth and his co-conspirators, Grant would be given sweeping powers over the entire Union Army. This meant Army personnel in pursuit of civilian targets. Secretary Stanton also sent a cable to the chief of police in New York City, requesting their 3 finest detectives to head up the growing manhunt. Washington City was humming. From local law enforcement to rank-and-file soldiers and even New York City detectives, every inch of the city was scoured. Hundreds of witnesses were interrogated, every possible lead, big or small, run down. The next major initiative Secretary Stanton put into action was ordering the 16th New York Cavalry to comb the countryside of Charles County, Maryland. To reach Richmond, Virginia, their assumed likely destination, Booth and his accomplices would have to cross the Potomac somewhere in southern Maryland. More than 3 hours before Abraham Lincoln took his last breath, a weary and suffering John Wilkes Booth, along with his last disciple Davy Herold, arrived at a farmhouse in Charles County, about 6 miles from the village of Bryantown, Maryland. Booth wrote in his journal that they had ridden 60 miles that night, although in reality it was closer to 30. That passage would be one of many inconsistencies, exaggerations, and over-dramatizations that appear in Booth's writings during his days on the run. This particular farmhouse, though quite familiar to Booth, was not originally intended to be a stop on his escape into Virginia. But Booth was in immediate need of medical attention, and the farm was owned by his friend, Dr. Samuel Mudd.
The broken leg really complicated everything.
Terry Alford, author of Fortune's Fool, the biography of John Wilkes Booth.
It's probably one of the reasons they caught him as fast as they did. It wasn't a compound break. It was a simple fracture of the leg, and it was the smaller of the 2 bones in the lower leg. Basically, it was a high ankle break. It's very, very painful. And Booth also, I think, in jumping, hurt his back to an unknown extent. So he complained a lot of back pain also on his escape. But they did have a doctor friend down in the country who had been at one point agreeable to their plan to kidnap Lincoln. So they decided to go to him. They weren't honest with him right at first. They didn't tell him, of course, what Booth had done. They thought that might put him off because the doctor was a country doctor with a family and a practice and, a house and a farm and things to lose. And, he wasn't a fanatic like Booth was. They concealed what had actually happened. They just said, "Oh, I fell off my horse," something like that.
Booth and Herold knew they were likely still riding ahead of the history-changing news of their actions. Not wanting to implicate an innocent man, the 2 accomplices chose not to divulge their secret to Dr. Mudd. By the light of an oil lamp, Dr. Mudd cut off the leather riding boot on Booth's left foot. He set the bone and splinted the leg below the knee. Booth and Herold then promptly passed out in an upstairs bedroom, having been awake for nearly 24 hours by this point.
The thing you need to do here is stay off of it, rest it, reset it. Don't aggravate it. Don't fall on it. Don't hit it. It needs total rest. The one thing Booth couldn't do because Booth has to keep moving fast.
The following morning, as Lincoln's body was being transported back to the White House, Davy Herold woke early and asked Dr. Mudd if he would help him secure a carriage to make Booth's journey more comfortable. The pretense they were operating under for Dr. Mudd's benefit was that the men were traveling back to Washington and in no particular hurry given the celebrations underway. In search of a carriage, the men set off for nearby Bryantown. As they approached, Davy suddenly stopped short. Bryantown was under the control of Union troops. Of course, Davy knew why. Staying calm, Davy gave Dr. Mudd an excuse about being worried about Booth and headed back to the farm. Mudd, having ridden all the way, decided to go into town and take care of other business. Mudd had no reason to be nervous. He was completely unaware, as was nearly everyone, of the momentous events of the previous evening in Washington City. Davy rode hard back to Mudd's farm. He and Booth had decisions to make. Now in Bryantown, Dr. Mudd heard the news of Lincoln's assassination almost immediately. Members of the 16th New York were spreading the word, asking if anyone had seen or heard of the perpetrators. Mudd could barely believe what he was being told. The murderer was none other than the actor John Wilkes Booth. He, along with an accomplice, were believed to have fled to southern Maryland en route to Virginia. Dr. Mudd aroused no suspicions. He went about his business and made his way towards home. Mudd needed to have a word with his old friend. Mudd was hardly a supporter of Lincoln. His personal views were far more aligned with the South when it came to racial inequality. Mudd despised Lincoln. In fact, during the war, he'd been quite an easy convert into Booth's cadre of rebel spies. And yes, Mudd was willing to assist in any kidnapping scheme Booth could cook up. But Dr. Mudd was no murderer. And thanks to Booth's lies of omission, Mudd found himself complicit in the assassination of the President of the United States. Though furious at the potentially life-threatening predicament Booth had placed him in, Dr. Mudd stayed true to his Southern sympathies. He refused to betray the man who had struck such a fierce blow in the name of the Confederacy. He allowed Booth and Herold to stay and rest. When later confronted by the manhunters, Mudd would admit that the suspects had indeed been there on the night of the assassination. But when pressed, he would send the authorities in the wrong direction in hopes of giving Booth and Herold the best possible chance of making it across the Potomac and into Virginia. Mudd would also provide the fugitives with names of fellow compatriots, men who would be likely to help with food, shelter, transportation, and whatever else two assassins on the lam would require for survival. Over the years, Booth had compiled his own list of contacts. This list was designed to serve as a bastardized version of the Underground Railroad, a series of safe houses from Maryland to Richmond, Virginia, that would guarantee an escape route for Booth and his accomplices. Given their current predicament, Booth and Herold needed whatever help they could get. By this time, almost 18 hours had passed since Booth fired the shot. Interestingly, Dr. Mudd's news from Bryantown was Booth's official confirmation that Lincoln was dead. Mudd had heard the news directly from a Union soldier who was tasked with apprehending President Lincoln's assassin. He had done it. Undoubtedly, in a state of exuberance, it's doubtful Booth even registered much of what Mudd had to say after he relayed the news. What did get through to Booth was the name Samuel Cox. Cox would prove instrumental in Booth's next great hurdle, crossing the Potomac. More of the Ides of April after the break. It was 1 a.m. on April 16th, 1865, Easter Sunday. Somehow Booth and Herold were still mostly ahead of the news. By now, it had been more than 24 hours since the attack, and a full 18 hours since news of the president's death had lit up the telegraph wires from coast to coast. Given the hour, it was with some reluctance that Colonel Cox received two weary travelers in the pre-dawn stillness of what would come to be known as Black Easter. Although the exact nature of their conversation is lost to history, it can be well assumed that Booth gave it up. He was desperate for help, and who more than Cox would appreciate what Booth had accomplished? So, while the nation mourned their president on Easter Sunday, John Wilkes Booth was offered a lifeline in the form of a friend of Samuel Cox, a mysterious man known far and wide as the River Ghost. Booth and Herold were instructed to ride less than a mile from Cox's farm to a nearly impenetrable pine thicket and await this strange man who would deliver them from their plight. Thomas Jones was a waterman. He knew the Potomac of southern Maryland better than anyone, having fished those waters his entire life. On its western shore lay Virginia, the very heart of the Confederacy. Jones' particular set of skills were invaluable to the Southern cause during the war years. He had an uncanny knack for avoiding Union patrol boats. By April of 1865, Jones was out of money, a widower, and without purpose now that the end of the war was in sight. Booth biographer Terry Alford.
Jones had a house on the bluff of the Potomac that you could see many miles up and down the river. So you could see if any gunboats or federal patrols were going back and forth. And he would smuggle people and mail and messages across the river, and very, very successfully. He did it the whole war, was only caught one time. But that one time, while he was in prison in Washington, his wife died while soldiers were living in the house, Northern soldiers. And he hated them for that. That was as personal as the war could get. He lost his wife there and was left with all these kids. I would say it turned an enemy into a really bitter, bitter foe in Jones. So Jones was willing to do anything. He brought food to Booth and Herold. While they were hiding, he brought newspapers. He brought hot coffee when he could get it. He really kept them going for a couple of days in the swamp while Booth kind of caught his breath. What actually happened was the federal patrols looking for Booth ran right by him and further on down the road. So the search outran him. He was behind them. So he was kind of safe. They thought he was further away than he was, as long as he kept quiet and concealed in that pine thicket.
Author Walter Starr.
Lincoln dies on the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And on Easter Sunday, throughout the North, people come to church to hear kind of two messages. One is the traditional message of the resurrection of Christ and hope and the future. And the other is the death of Abraham Lincoln, which for many of them, they have only heard about maybe 12 hours. Maybe they haven't heard until that Sunday morning in church. And I think of all those sort of average Americans sitting in the pews dealing with those conflicting, confusing emotions, and then somehow on Monday morning going back to their various tasks, whether that's running the War Department or being a clerk.
As dawn broke on Easter Sunday morning, Samuel Cox sent for Jones and asked him to come to the farm on urgent business. There were two men on the run, Cox explained. They needed sanctuary in Virginia. Jones was the only man who could get them across the river. Just the day before, Jones had run into a pair of Union soldiers patrolling the eastern shore of the Potomac. They had informed Jones of the death of the president and told him to be on the lookout for the killers who were thought to be in the area. Jones' mind was racing as he rode to the Cox farm. Back in Washington City, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would soon shift his focus from ensuring the continuation of the government to the funeral arrangements for his friend. The world would surely take note of how a young nation honored its slain leader. Stanton would stage an event worthy of a man like Lincoln. Despite the hundreds of detectives, police officers, and soldiers searching the greater Washington area, Booth remained a phantom nearly 48 hours after the attack. By April 16th, the reward being offered by the federal government for the capture of John Wilkes Booth had grown to $30,000. It's the modern equivalent of a $500,000 bounty on the actor's head. But still, the best lead Secretary Stanton had was a mysterious letter found in Booth's hotel room that suggested he may flee to Baltimore. The smart money, however, was on Virginia. Colonel Cox informed Thomas Jones that indeed Abraham Lincoln's assassins were hiding in a pine thicket, awaiting his assistance in crossing the Potomac. Jones instantly understood the dangers of involving himself in their flight. But in spite of the risks, Jones would do everything he could to help the men. On April 17th, Thomas Jones rendezvoused with Booth and Herold in the woods. The men were tired, dirty, desperately hungry for both food and information. Their horses weren't much better off. Jones took in the scene. He would later remark that Herold was scarcely more than a boy. He then set his eyes on Booth for the first time. The man known as the River Ghost was completely starstruck. He would later recall the moment with great detail and more than a little affection. Jones wrote, quote, "He was lying on the ground with his head supported by his hand. His carbine, pistols, and knife were close by behind him. A blanket was drawn partly over him. His slouch hat and crutch were lying by him. He was dressed in black clothes, travel-stained. Though he was exceedingly pale, and his features bore the evident trace of suffering, I have seldom, if ever, seen a more strikingly handsome man."
Very attractive, very seductive person. He had friends in the acting profession and in the hotels and other places. And as time passed, decades passed after the murder, and they felt safe, they spoke about some of his better qualities. He was generous to people. He seems kind-hearted, and he had friends of both genders. He certainly was a very plausible person and very magnetic as an individual, yes. And it wasn't just acting. He had some appealing qualities as a human being, and that really sets him apart. As I always like to think, he's not a born loser. He's somebody with something to lose.
Although grateful for the help, Jones's idea on how to get the men to safety was disheartening to both Booth and Herold. Jones decided that the best course of action was no action at all. The men should wait quietly in the safety of the woods until the Union patrols moved south. Then, when the coast was clear, they would quietly row to the Virginia shore, just as Jones had done countless times. The men needed to trust him, Jones insisted. They needed to wait. For his part, Jones would visit daily with food and water and feed their horses. And newspapers, as many as you can get, Booth demanded. Remember, he was an actor. He wanted to read his reviews, to soak in the great praise that was surely being heaped on him for his tremendous gift to the Confederacy, as well as the sorrow and confusion the North must be mired in. Surely the will of the Union was broken, and the vigor of the South reignited. Anticipation of such news was enough to keep Booth's mind off the prospect of days spent in the woods, because as a man whose previous residence was a posh hotel, John Wilkes Booth wasn't made for such uncomfortable accommodations. Davy Herold, however, was beside himself with joy. He had become an audience of one, the sole focus of his idol for as long as they were required to wait until Jones made the decision to go. Herold was no doubt regaled with heroic retellings of the attack at Ford's and the breathtaking escape through Washington City, all from the most acclaimed performer of the day. John Wilkes Booth always needed an audience. On April 17th, Booth and Herold's first full night in the woods, Lewis Powell was arrested as he arrived at Mary Surratt's boarding house. By the early hours of the following day, Powell had been positively identified as the lunatic who tore through the Seward house, severely wounding several men in his attempt to assassinate the Secretary of State. Powell was formally arrested and remanded to a cell aboard the USS Saugus, an ironclad warship at anchor in the Anacostia River. The Saugus was so ordered by Secretary Stanton to be used as a floating prison for those found to be complicit in the murder of President Lincoln. Powell would not again draw a single breath as a free man for the rest of his life. As promised, Thomas Jones returned to the pine thicket with provisions and bad news. The area remained under heavy patrol, and the fugitives' stay in the woods would be extended by several days. But for the moment, Booth couldn't be bothered. He instantly began scanning the newspapers for mentions of his triumphant performance at Ford's and the glorious victory he had procured for the Confederacy.
We don't know the name of the newspapers he had. The ones Jones would have had access to were probably Washington, D.C. papers, maybe Baltimore. But they were papers in federal areas, right, under Northern control. And naturally, the opinions were terrible. And the opinions they were reprinting from Southern sources were bad, too. I mean, thoughtful Southerners realized this is not going to do us any good. I mean, we are totally beaten and now defenseless. I mean, we don't have an army to protect ourselves down in the South. The North can do about anything they want to. They can pull us apart, right? And they're going to want some revenge. Yeah, I mean, naturally, revenge is not a very noble motive, but it's a very human one, right? To want to spread the pain I'm feeling to other people. And so, Booth was horrified by what he read. And, you would think his common sense would tell him that assassination it may take sort of a mad courage to do what he did, to psych himself up enough to do this with the consequences.
One can imagine Booth crestfallen upon his discovery that he had in fact been vilified by every newspaper Jones had brought him. In fact, the harshest criticisms of Booth were from the Southern papers. Booth couldn't believe what he was reading. His condemnation in the South meant a full acceptance of defeat. The assassination was being derided as the very worst outcome for the future of the seceded states. Because of Booth, they would now be forced to live in the shadow of a martyred president and claim as their own the man who murdered him. Any attempts to distance the South from Booth's deeds was entirely hopeless. Southern leaders could only publicly beg for a merciful posture from the North in the spirit of the very man who they now mourned. It was in response to this news, sometime during this extended stay in the woods, that Booth would compose a diary entry filled with inconsistencies, untruths, and obvious attempts to rewrite recent history.
Until today, nothing was even thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months we had worked to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. But its failure was owing to others who did not strike for their country with a heart. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. Passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night, with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it. Though we hated to kill, our country owed all her trouble to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country.
His writing then abruptly stops, most likely due to the arrival of Thomas Jones in the thicket. Let's deconstruct Booth's words from the point of view of a man who felt his very honor was at stake. He begins with a statement of justification as it relates to the murder.
Nothing was even thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs.
Booth then pulls back a little by admitting that at first they only wanted to capture Lincoln. Then, he explains, they felt that time was running out and something great and decisive was necessary. He blames others for not striking with a heart, but it's in the next handful of lines that we get a glimpse into the shattered ego of an angry, petulant child. Booth dismisses the newspaper's accounts of his cowardice by proclaiming that he struck boldly and that he walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends. Referring to the packed house at Ford's as Lincoln's friends was definitely a stretch. He also mentions a soldier was with the president to further insinuate that Lincoln was surrounded and protected. Booth's scrawlings are widely considered an obvious attempt to recast himself as a bold hero, rather than the sneaking coward that he actually was.
You're shooting a person from concealment who has no chance to protect themselves, who is unarmed like Lincoln was. I mean, it's hard to read heroism into that. And that was exactly what he heard from Northern and Southern soldiers. Interesting point. The only places that seemed to celebrate what he did were a few places in Texas that had yet been overwhelmed by the Northern armies. And I think Booth was stunned by the negative reaction. If he thought that the South would be regenerated or the North would fall into revolution, it wasn't going to happen. As Lincoln had said earlier in the war, they shoot me, they just get somebody to take my place. I don't see what benefit would come from killing me. And he was right.
And who does Booth blame for all of this confusion? The news media. He gaslights the public by warning them not to believe what they read in the papers, or even what they had seen with their own eyes. It would be 151 years before the perfect term would be coined for what Booth was trying to say: fake news. Booth and Herold's hideout in the pine thicket would last 5 days and 4 nights. Their seclusion was marked by the unfortunate decision to kill their horses. Jones believed they made too much noise and required too much maintenance. Davy, though an animal lover, agreed. The horses had proved worthy mounts, and Davy knew they deserved better than a bullet to the head in a Maryland swamp. But the men had much bigger problems ahead of them and couldn't risk capture. It was during their last night in the woods, on April 20th, that George Atzerodt was finally found. Nearly a week had passed since the attacks on President Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward. Atzerodt was captured in Germantown, Maryland, at the home of his cousin, and like Powell was imprisoned aboard an ironclad warship while he awaited trial. It was also on April 20th that Secretary Stanton upped the ante by increasing the reward money for the apprehension of those involved in the assassination plot. The United States government was now offering the unbelievable sum of $100,000 in total. That would be nearly $2 million in today's money. The reward was divided into 3 sections: $50,000, or nearly $1 million, for Booth alone, and $25,000 each for Davy Herold and, surprisingly, John Surratt. Surratt had the good fortune of being in Canada on the night of the assassination. Though he was surely aware of the events of April 14th, he was also decidedly ignorant of the arrest of his mother and the bounty on his own head. Stanton and his intelligence community still believed that Surratt played a much more significant role than he actually had. Faced with the news of his perceived involvement in the plot and the enormous bounty offered for his capture, Surratt immediately fled to Europe. he would remain there for more than 18 months.
To you, my darling.
No, to you.
The Roses were living the dream.
More champagne for me, please.
Until it all came crashing down.
He got fired. Fired?
From the director of Meet the Parents.
You're a failure. Women don't like that.
If you need a shoulder or an inner thigh to lean on.
This Friday.
I just want the house.
We want everything.
Wow.
Stop.
You stop!
And see The Roses.
These people.
The Roses. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent. In theaters everywhere Friday.
Talk about stepping up! Bang! Bang!
It's time to level up your game. Introducing the all-new ESPN app. All of ESPN, all in one place. Your home for the most live sports and the best championship moments.
The electricity is palpable.
Step up your game with no annual contract required. It's the ultimate fan experience. Level up for more on the ESPN app or at stream.espn.com. Sign up now.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to
Carvana.
Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
Empower.
Tim collects bobbleheads. A lot of bobbleheads. Baseball bobbleheads. Race car bobbleheads. Little chihuahua bobbleheads. He's got an entire room strictly for bobbleheads. Does he need them? No. Is his wife mad about it? A little. But Tim works with Empower, and he got good at money, so he can be a little bad. Ooh, horse bobblehead. Classy, Tim. Empower. Invest well, live a little. Start today at Empower.com.
Surratt's escape across the Atlantic would ultimately save his own life, though he would never see his mother again. On the morning of April 21st, Booth and Herold got the news they'd been waiting for. It was time to cross. Thomas Jones quietly led them to shore, where a hidden rowboat lay waiting. Booth was told to retrieve his pocket compass. The fugitives were gifted a single candle and an exact heading that would lead them to the mouth of a creek on the Virginia shore and the property of Elizabeth Quisenberry. Quisenberry was a member of the underground rebellion who could be counted on to help. Jones wished the men well and watched them disappear into a night so dark it was impossible to tell where the river ended and the night sky began. Amidst that darkness, Booth feared that lighting the candle might betray their position to Union gunboats in the area, and because that candle was never lit, Jones didn't notice that almost immediately young Davy Herold had begun rowing entirely in the wrong direction. By the early hours of April 22nd, more than a week after the assassination, John Wilkes Booth had yet to step foot on Virginia soil.
Envision this. You're setting off from the bank on the Maryland side, you're crossing the Potomac to the Virginia side, where hopefully you'll be safer. But it's pitch black. You're following a compass heading. It's almost like swimming with your eyes closed. You know what direction you're going, but you don't know when you can hit something. And on his two occasions to cross, he actually did see and come one time really close to a Federal gunboat. But the river there is narrowed. The current is very strong. They had one paddle and kind of a broken oar. Water was constantly lapping in the boat. Herold would take off his hat, scoop the water out, like his hat was a pail.
This chapter of Booth's escape, comprising more than a third of his time on the run, came to be known as the Lost Week. It would serve as something of an intermission in the great drama that was playing out. The long days of inaction infuriated Edwin Stanton, who was desperate for the story to reach a conclusion. Despite hundreds of arrests, the star of the show, the president's assassin, was still a free man. Booth's elusive nature would sow a great deal of fear, doubt, and confusion in the minds of the American public. Was our government really unable to catch one man that the entire country was looking for. Although they successfully eluded authorities, the lost week was a difficult time for Booth. Every waking second was an exercise in pain tolerance. He was also acutely aware by this time that in spite of killing the president, his mission had ultimately been a failure. He was disgusted at the news of Powell's bloody rampage through the Seward house, which, despite the chaos, Secretary Seward had survived. To Booth, Atzerodt was a coward who failed to meet the moment. But perhaps the most hurtful development was the news that Booth was decidedly not being embraced by his beloved Confederacy. On the contrary, Southern politicians, including the governor of Virginia, published open letters to the new president, Andrew Jackson, denouncing the actions of Booth. And the worst realization of all, Booth had made a martyr out of Lincoln and elevated him to a status that a living person would never have been able to achieve. Not only was the Lincoln assassination the greatest crime in the history of our nation, it could also be considered the greatest miscalculation of perceived civic necessity on the part of Booth ever committed. It's fair to assume that Booth was pondering all of this as Davy pulled the oars and began rowing, not southwest as instructed, but due west, upriver, until they made landfall in Maryland. The problem now was there wasn't a person left in Maryland who would have been willing to assist the fugitives. The best they could do was another night outside in the woods. It was on this night, with the full knowledge that his deeds would be harshly judged by history, that Booth made his final plea to posterity.
After being hunted like a dog through swamps, woods, and last night being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return, wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for? What made Tell a hero? And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat. My action was purer than either of theirs. One hoped to be great himself, the other had not only his country's, but his own wrongs to avenge. I hoped for no gains. I knew no private wrong. I struck for my country, and that alone. A country that groaned beneath this tyranny and prayed for this end. And yet now, behold the cold hand they extend to me. Tonight, I will once more try the river with the intent to cross, though I have a greater desire, and almost a mind, to return to Washington and, in a measure, clear my name, which I feel I can do. I do not repent the blow I struck. I may before God, but not to man. I think I have done well, though I am abandoned with the curse of Cain upon me, when if the world knew my heart, that one blow would have made me great, though I did desire no greatness. I have too great a soul to die like a criminal. Oh, may he spare me that, and let me die bravely. I bless the entire world, have never hated or wronged anyone. This last was not a wrong, unless God deems it so. And it's with him to damn or bless me. And for this brave boy with me, who often prays, yes, before and since, with a true and sincere heart. Was it crime in him? If so, why can he pray the same? I do not wish to shed a drop of blood, but I must fight the course. 'Tis all that's left me.
On the next episode, the fugitives finally land in Virginia and find the Southern hospitality they've been yearning for. Little do they know, it's the beginning of the end. That's next time on the Ides of April. The Ides of April was created, produced, and written by Brandon Morgan. Our executive producers are Brandon Morgan and Matt Del Piano. Zach McNeese is our story editor, sound designer, and mixer. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thanks for listening.